we know that about a quarter of abortions, and these are from studies in multiple different countries and contexts, up to a quarter of abortions are pressured by men. And this is something that obviously is profoundly at odds both with life and with a woman's choice. And so we should all be agreed that men have a duty to, at the very least, stop other men from coercing women into abortions. That's something that everyone can agree on.
Hello Edictum friends. It is my pleasure to be returning as a guest host on this Edictum podcast. For the past few months, I have been looking into what seems to always be a hot topic, the issue of abortion. Now, even more so than for the past few decades. The biggest challenge for me has been to find information that has not been ideologically hijacked. And even though I am aware that everyone has an agenda, I do want to know that at least it comes from an honest place. This is why I am delighted to have the opportunity of a conversation with a bright young man, passionate about this topic, but most importantly, knowledgeable and honest. Dr. Calum Miller, welcome to the Edictum podcast.
Thank you for having me on.
Dr. Miller is a bioethicist, a graduate from University of Oxford Medical School. He is currently working as a medical doctor in the UK, but he also teaches philosophy at the University of Oxford. In such a distinguished place of education, he researches abortion policies, abortion and mental health, and quite a few other meaningful topics. Great to have you on. How did a young, unmarried man like you end up speaking on such an important yet hotly debated issue like abortion here in Romania?
Yeah, well, thank you again for having me on. It really started at medical school, I think. So I grew up in a family that was not pro-life, really. We never spoke about it, at least. I still don't really know what my parents think. We kind of were a vaguely Christian family, but not kind of conservative Christian, not culture warrior at all. Never really spoke about kind of faith in the home. So it wasn't really something that came across my mind or onto my radar until university. Now, most people in the UK just don't think about this topic at all, including most Christians. But if you work in medicine, then you kind of have to think about it a little bit. You have to decide, is this something that I'm going to be involved in or not? So the Christian Medical Fellowship in the UK does talk about it quite a lot, and most Christian doctors would refuse to perform abortions, for example. And that would be quite a lot, as would most Muslim doctors, and we have many Muslim doctors as well. So really it was going to medical school that got me thinking about this in the first place. And there were kind of a few things that happened there that really began to change my mind on it. So in the first place, I was a little bit involved in some of these talks going on by the Christian Medical Fellowship, and one talk by a doctor in particular really got me thinking about this particular issue. Another was having friends in America who I saw cared deeply about this topic and were knowledgeable, as much as the stereotype of Americans is, stupid, uneducated rednecks. I was really talking to some of the brightest people I knew. These were people who were studying philosophy and ethics at Princeton and Oxford and all the really, top academic institutions in the world. And for them, it was a big issue, and they really had arguments that made sense. And so as I was reading about this topic, debating this topic, I really just came around to see that the pro-life view was the one that made the most intellectual and made the most intellectual sense and was the most humane. Now, at the same time, of course, I was at medical school, and I had done embryology in my first year. And, once you do that, you really see through so much of the pro-abortion propaganda straight away.
For our younger viewers, those that do not know what embryology is, can you, in a nutshell?
So embryology is the study of development of a human life in the womb. So it starts at conception and then develops for 9 months until the baby's born. And so I had seen this and read, just as a basic scientific fact, a human organism begins at fertilization. This is when the heart develops. This is when the brain develops. And so when I saw people in the abortion debate saying it's not alive, or, it's just a religious belief that life begins at conception, I just knew that that was false straight away. It was literally what I had learned as a training doctor at what's widely regarded as the best medical school in the world. And so that really kind of allowed me to see through some of the more shallow, superficial arguments for abortion. This is clearly a human life. Everyone agrees that it's a human life. The real question that was more debatable was, are all human lives valuable? And so that was the question that I wrestled with for a couple of years. And, I saw the arguments that all human beings were equal and all of them deserved human rights, including the ones in the womb. I saw the arguments that the right to life supersedes anyone else's right to autonomy or choice over that life. We don't have a choice over life or death. And I saw the effect that abortion had on women. I would see what abortion involved, the ending of that life, often in horrendously brutal ways, and sometimes at very late stages in pregnancy. And I saw the psychiatric trauma that it had on women and the clear evidence that abortion was harmful to women's mental health. So all of these things kind of went together over the few years I was at medical school to gradually change my mind. And I didn't kind of expect to be pulled into kind of the debate. Even after that point, I just spoke about it on Facebook every now and then. I didn't kind of really speak about it publicly in public settings very much, but I really found that I was the only voice in the UK, or one of the only voices. There are some others, but there are so few people talking about it in the UK that I wanted to speak about it and then got invitations to speak about it. And as time went on, kind of more doors kept opening, and I realized there was the need for a voice all over Europe. And so I was privileged and honored to be invited to Romania to speak about this. So we had a conference yesterday, which was really exciting and encouraging. Pretty much all young people wanting to know more about this, wanting to see the reality of abortion, the reality of unborn life. And I really think it's an encouraging turning point in this debate, that we can talk about these issues in a way that is compassionate, that is humane, and that is honest, because I think that's really lacking. So it's been a real privilege to be here.
Oh, I'm glad you're here in Romania, even though on the issue of abortion, Romania has kind of a bad reputation, and it's based on numbers. You kept mentioning the debates, and I wouldn't consider Facebook as the best platform to have debates, but I think it's relevant in a way that it shows the level of disdain or of disrespect for the other side's opinion. Is there such a thing as a civil debate between the pro-life and the pro-choice movement, or are we merely left with a battle for the hearts of those that are undecided or maybe just indifferent?
Yeah, well, I would say try Twitter, which is even worse, because inevitably you can't talk about this topic reasonably in a couple of sentences.
Yeah.
It's kind of insane that we even try, but we do, and I do. So I'm the chief of sinners in that respect. So I think civil debate between the opposing sides is very rare. I would say it does exist. So I have had a couple of debates with a lady called Anne Furedi, who was the CEO of our main private abortion provider in the UK. And I would say it's unusual, but we have had a number of really constructive civil debates. I think it's helped that she is also an advocate for free speech. So when we have kind of censorship in the UK, she's one of the first people speaking out. And she thinks that women who are having abortions or considering abortions are best served by having a proper debate. She says that, women that she saw in the abortion clinic weren't triggered by people having this debate. And actually women having abortions or considering abortions had to wrestle with it. And it was an important part of their decision making. Most women think about the ethics of abortion when they're considering abortion. And so she says, if we just get rid of debate, we're not serving those women. And in some cases, I don't know if she'd go this far, but it seems clear to me that in some cases, not having that debate means some women will go ahead with an abortion and then only later realize that they disagree with it and can have really profound trauma from that. And I would bet my life on that. It's just an obvious fact that does happen. And so the debate is needed, and there are some, I believe, really genuine, sincere people on the opposing side who see the need for debate and are able to do the debate in a civil, constructive way. Now, that said, I would say it is very rare. So there's a reason that she's pretty much the only person I've debated on this topic in the UK, is because she's one of the only people who is willing to debate on this topic. There are a couple of others, but really very, very few. And she's almost outcast by some of her colleagues just for saying this. we should talk about this properly and seriously. So I would say, however, that there's a huge range of people in the middle who do respect different opinions and who do listen on this subject. And I think that's the really key thing for me, is that although when you get to the kind of real ideologues and activists on the other side, there's usually a stance of closed-mindedness and censorship, I would say that the large majority of the people in the middle, including, as we said, most women seeking abortion, most people want to hear different perspectives on this, as long as it's done compassionately and gently and constructively. And most people have a view that's kind of in the middle. They think abortion should be allowed in some situations, not in others, up to a certain point in pregnancy, but not after that. And so I believe that most people really have a view that is in the middle and that can be moved, a bit each way, or sometimes all the way in either direction. And those people, I believe, are really served well by good, constructive debate. And so, whether it's debate with those people or whether it's debate with the activists on the other side, but for an audience in the middle, I think there is benefit in it. But it reminds us of the need to speak at all times, no matter how aggressive the activists on the other side might be. It reminds us to always speak with respect and
even compassion,
candor and compassion, because the people who are watching, I think, really are the people that we're serving most of the time in these debates, and I think they can often learn a lot from them.
I always encourage my viewers and Edictum friends to listen to the other side, to take time and detach themselves from their agenda, their side, and try to look and have a different perspective. Not necessarily because I want them to change their mind, but they have to be aware that this conversation is between people. We're not fighting against someone that we want to obliterate. We're here to change hearts and minds and hopefully improve the society through our debates. And you mentioned Anne Furedi, and I was happy to see her on a podcast that you recently, a prominent podcast that you recently took part in the UK. And what struck me was her genuine desire to understand the other side. I think that I always see when you are presenting the pro-life case, and it's encouraging to me to see that there are such people left, because it's so easy to split everything between those extremists and the other extremists, and everybody else just tunes out because there's so much noise at the periphery. They don't want to be bothered. Yet, honest debate is, I think it's useful and requested for a dialogue that brings about change, meaningful change. Yet we're talking about debate. We're having a conversation here, and we are two men speaking on a topic that has been labeled as women's health care. On the other hand, it should be a recognizable truth that men are part of this thing. They are part of the problem. They should also be part of the solution. How do we make men aware of this thing?
Yeah, well, I think it's a great question, and I thought it was really striking that at the conference I was at, the large majority of people in the audience were women, which in a way is encouraging, because it was showing that, the pro-life movement isn't just a whole load of men who want to control women's bodies. In fact,
as the narrative goes.
Yeah, I mean, the overwhelming majority, it was actually really striking. Like it was a huge majority of women who were interested in this topic yesterday. And I do think it was almost to the extent that we actually want more men in this debate. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. I mean, one is that we know that about a quarter of abortions, and these are from studies in multiple different countries and contexts, up to a quarter of abortions are pressured by men. And this is something that obviously is profoundly at odds both with life and with a woman's choice. And so we should all be agreed that men have a duty to, at the very least, stop other men from coercing women into abortions. That's something that everyone can agree on, and it's common. I think another way is a more kind of soft pressure that kind of the legalization of abortion has encouraged the kind of irresponsibility of men and the abandonment by men of women and their children. And you really see this. There was a really good study in the US by a Nobel Prize winning economist and his wife, who is now Joe Biden's Secretary of the Treasury. So I assume both of them are pro-choice. In fact, the Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen, was speaking about this the other day and clearly is pro-choice. But what they were saying is that in the kind of late 1960s and early 1970s, America was pretty much on the way to eradicating poverty in the US. The machinations of the society and the industry and so on had really advanced and had brought incredible prosperity to the US, and they were well on the way to getting rid of poverty, and it had declined enormously in the country. And then really pretty much at the same time, contraception and abortion were legalized nationwide across the country by a couple of Supreme Court decisions. And they said that what this did was it led to a huge rise in children born out of wedlock. And even though abortion was supposed to get rid of children born out of wedlock, it actually had the opposite effect. And that's because typically before then, if a man got a woman pregnant, this would happen more rarely, but it still happened. If it did happen, they would have a shotgun marriage, and the man would be there to support the woman and to support the child. And of course, that didn't always work out. And of course, there were a minority of cases where it led to very bad marriages. No one would deny that. But at the same time, for the most part, it actually did provide stable commitment. And we know that, marriage is one of the most important factors for bringing children out of poverty and for economic prosperity, as well as a whole range of other things. Yeah. We know marriage has huge benefits. And so what you saw then was, once abortion was legalized, it didn't just mean that any woman having an unexpected pregnancy or a pregnancy out of wedlock could suddenly abort it, because this is a traumatic event for a woman. It's a distressing event for a woman. Many women don't want to have abortions. And so what you actually found was that because the availability of abortion caused more of these pregnancies, because it gave a backup option, it actually didn't have a significant effect on the number of children born out of wedlock, other than the fact that it increased them.
Yeah.
And so what you found was, beforehand, unexpected pregnancies and pregnancies out of wedlock happened, but generally the parents would then come together and stay together for the sake of the child. Now, abortion was supposed to liberate women and give them the freedom of having sex with whoever they wanted to, whenever they wanted to, without the responsibility of a child. What it actually did was it did exactly that for men. So for men, it exactly meant that they could have sex with whoever they wanted, whenever they wanted, without any responsibility. As Anne Furedi herself says, or I think she said her grandmother said, a man can always pack his bags and walk away.
And that's a really sad reality to this day.
Exactly. And if you think about it, for the woman, it's never like that, because the woman will always have the burden of an unwanted pregnancy, regardless of what she does. And so either she will have the pregnancy and keep it, and she will have the baby and look after the child by herself and go through the pregnancy by herself, which is a huge undertaking that really biologically can only fall on the woman, but socially and in terms of the support has to be, enormously supported by the man and by society. She has to go through that her own if she keeps the baby, which she still usually would do. Whereas by contrast, if she has an abortion, that's supposedly the easy way out. But even then, it's a woman going through an abortion. This is never an easy thing, and it's a distressing thing, and it's often a traumatic thing. And so what you had was, it created a situation where women's liberation was actually men's liberation, and it left women with either the burden of an abortion or the burden of a single person having a pregnancy and then raising the child. And so these economists point out that this led to a huge increase in what they call the feminization of poverty. Poverty became specifically a thing that affected women disproportionately.
Single motherhood.
Exactly. And this is the reality today. How many single fathers do you see kind of with the economic burden and the social burden and carrying all the difficulties of parenting by themselves? It happens, of course, but it's so much rarer than that falling on the woman. And so there were huge kind of ways in which abortion affected in every country the dynamic between men and women. And there are many other reasons that men have to speak out on this, but I really believe that this is one of the key reasons, is that men have a duty and a responsibility to be fathers and to be husbands. And abortion frees them of that responsibility, because they can always say, your body, your choice. Before that, they would say, our child, our responsibility. But if this child is no longer a child, and if it's no longer a responsibility, it just becomes the woman's body and the woman's choice, then that completely absolves the man of anything. He can just say, your body, your choice, which really means not my body, not my responsibility. And so the woman is the one with that burden. And so really, I think this has facilitated a huge amount of male irresponsibility. And ultimately, in many cases, it's not what women want and not what women need. I think we can easily get the picture of what women are supposed to want from the media, from sitcoms, and from the Hollywood elites, where sure, if you can afford to pay a babysitter all day and you can afford to do whatever you want with your child and have them looked after, and you're in the elite sector of society, sure, you can get by as a single parent. You can have a surrogate person to birth your baby even if you want.
Yeah.
But for the reality of most women, that's not how it works. For the reality for most people, pregnancy and child raising were not meant to be the responsibility of one person alone. They were meant to be the responsibility of both. And what abortion has done has taken that entire weight that was supposed to be put on a couple and on a wider family and on a wider community even, and it's taken that entire weight and put it all on the woman. And that has been profoundly disempowering for those women. So, as I say, for many reasons, men need to speak up on this, but I believe that one is a really central one.
There is this meme going around in this age of conversations through pictures and funny words with pro-choice activists demanding that if you are taking away our rights to abortion, that you should enforce fathers paying child support. And then there's the reaction of the conservatives saying, deal, we have a deal.
Well, it's amazing. So there was actually a funny story about this. So there was a state senator or representative from, I think it was maybe Ohio, I think it was one of the battleground states in the US, that was considering prohibiting abortion, obviously because of the stuff that's going on at the moment. And he said, I'm putting forward a bill that if we do ban abortion, we have to make sure women have their finances and everything taken support of. So I'm saying men have to pay this child support during the pregnancy. And he thought this was like an incredible gotcha, aha moment, where he showed the hypocrisy of the Republicans. Now, I'm not making a comment here about Republicans or Democrats. If the Democrats weren't so completely insane at the moment, I would probably naturally be one. But the Republicans, not only in one state, in the federal Congress, the Republicans put forward a bill saying exactly this. It was called the Unborn Child Support Act. It said that fathers have a responsibility to pay child support for their child to the mother from the time that pregnancy begins, because that's when the child's life begins and that's when the mother begins needing that support. And the Republicans had put this forward at a national level. And I guess like the other side was just so blind to what pro-lifers actually think that they think this was like an incredible bill to put forward when they did it. And they didn't even know that the Republicans had already done it nationally. Of course, it didn't pass nationally. We hope it does in future, but that's a decision for the other side to see whether they'll vote for it as well. So yeah, there's this incredible sense of, I think there really is a misunderstanding of what pro-lifers believe. Like, it's kind of like this whole sex strike thing that a lot of
women are putting
in the US are talking about, saying if you take away our right to abortion, then we're just not going to have sex with like random guys in. They say like hookup culture will be decimated.
Again, we have a deal.
They think this is jarring to Christian conservatives who they've spent like the last 100 years shouting at us because we believe in monogamy, because we believe in sex within marriage. And suddenly this is supposed to be like, we're supposed to be horrified by the idea of hookup culture disintegrating. It's just, it's truly bizarre. And I think it does reflect a deeper reality of pro-lifers simply haven't been heard and no one actually knows what we believe.
Or it has been misinterpreted by the other side.
Yeah.
And if you go out and ask people what the pro-life movement is about, you will probably get answers that have nothing to do with the core values of the pro-life movement.
Absolutely.
And it's frightening to me because this extends even on the way abortion is described. You talked about the way Hollywood and celebrities in general paint the picture of single motherhood. They do the same thing for the abortion. Abortion is seen as a medical intervention that is slightly more annoying than removing a mole or having a cavity fixed, when the profound implications of an abortion not only on the ending of a life, but also on the trauma that a mother has to live through their entire life is incredible. And I think one way of bringing men about is having them understand that whenever you're withholding responsibility, whenever you're saying, as you said, I'm out, I'm opting out of this relationship because it's your body, your choice, as the movement says, whenever they do that, they're inflicting extra trauma. And you did mention the number of women that have coerced abortions, but I'm thinking also about all the women that they're opting for an abortion because they do not receive enough support.
Right.
It's one thing to coerce something or be indifferent, and the mother says, "Oh well, I don't feel like he's ready for this. I don't feel like his family is ready for this. My family is ready for this," and they end up having an abortion without stating that they were coerced and not being counted in that.
Yeah, I think I often divide it into hard pressure, which is up to a quarter of abortions, and then soft pressure, which is where it's not outrightly coerced, but it is either incentivized heavily, or a woman feels she's left with no other option to have an abortion, or she feels like if she doesn't have an abortion, she'll be punished in some way, even though that threat isn't, made explicit. Yeah. So 3/4 of pregnant women and new mothers in Scotland say that they are discriminated against by their employer as a result of their pregnancy and having a baby. And that's like 3/4. That's a huge number. And it's not funny at all. It's tragic. But it shows that even in those situations where there's no outright threat, have an abortion or you'll lose your job, women feel that threat is implicit. Either, and sometimes that's losing their job, sometimes it's the threat of losing their partner, sometimes it's losing the support of their parents. All sorts of things can implicitly pressure women into this. So even aside from that outright pressure, the large majority, I believe, of the rest of the abortions, I think, are done under that sort of implicit pressure in a way that also inhibits women's choice and means that the whole choice paradigm is I think distorted at least.
Yet, if you were to go out on the streets of Cluj, you're here in Cluj, if we were to go out and ask people what do they think the reasons for abortion are, I am 99% sure that high on the list, incest, rape, or high risk for the health of the mother, pregnancies, they will be on top. Mm-hmm. Yet, as you mentioned, and there is the Guttmacher Institute, which for those people researching abortion issues is a known institute, is the one that does all the research for Planned Parenthood. Mm-hmm. Yet they release periodically studies that show the number of people stating the reason for their abortion as being rape or incest or grave danger to the life of the mother is below 3%. Mm-hmm. What happens with the rest of those, of the 97% or more? It's basically becoming a lifestyle choice, maybe. It sounds harsh. It sounds, I'm using the kind of Hollywood rhetoric here. Everything is just, we're just choosing. But they made it, it's called the pro-choice movement. So basically they're fighting for the choice of having it. What are the main reasons?
Yeah, so you're right that the hard cases are really the tiny minority of abortions, and nevertheless, of course, they're used to justify the other 98%. And every interview I do, I'm asked about the question of rape and so on, and I think it's a really sort of a deflection away from the fact that the large majority of abortions are not for these sorts of reasons. So. For disability, the number of abortions is about 2% in the UK, 1.5%, and only a small proportion of those are for disabilities that are life-threatening. So, a lot of them will be the child is missing a hand, or the child has cleft palate even, or a clubfoot. So there's a very small percentage that are done because the child has a disability, and of course we know that even in those cases, the child in almost every case would prefer to be alive. So we're not doing it for their benefit. In terms of the number done to save the woman's life, it's a tiny fraction of 1%. So in the UK, there are 200,000 abortions each year, and the number to save the woman's life is a lot less than 100. I say that because the official number is around 90 to 100, but when you look at the reasons, it includes things that do not require an abortion to save the life, like mental health reasons. In one case, I saw one done for high blood cholesterol. So this clause seems to be abused, at least to some extent. So we know that the number is a lot less than 100, but it's difficult to say how much. Either way, that's a tiny fraction of 1%. In terms of the number done for rape, we don't collect statistics on that in the UK. But as you say, Guttmacher have done a study quite a while ago now on this in the US. I think they found out of about 1,000 abortions. The number that were done where rape was the main reason for abortion was between 0 and 4 out of 1,000. They didn't actually say, they just said it was below this percentage. So it might have been not a 1%. Single one. It might, it was less than 0.5%. We know that. And then, there are other studies as well that show that the number of abortions done because of rape is a very small percentage, less than 1%. So there are multiple studies showing this. So what are most abortions done for? It kind of differs from country to country, and it differs from study to study. But in general, you find the bulk of the reasons are to do with education and career. And this can obviously be, quite vague in the sense that, in many sub-Saharan African countries, if a girl becomes pregnant during school, which often is not her choice, she's often abused or coerced into it by an older man who promises her things for paying for schooling and so on. If a girl becomes pregnant in many schools in sub-Saharan Africa, she will be kicked out of school. And in those sorts of situations where she's likely to lose all her education and have no career prospects at all for the future in a very deprived part of the world, and where she's most likely been abused or, coerced in some way by an older man, the education career reason seems like a very serious reason, and it's something that you can entirely understand and sympathize with. In other cases, we know that career reason is really, I want to advance further in my already impressive career where I earn a decent amount and so on, and it's not an absolutely trivial reason, but it's not the kind of reason we would normally allow to someone to take someone else's life, or it would be very far from that kind of reason. So most of the reasons are kind of a mix of financial and career and education. Finance is maybe about 30%, but it differs between studies. A lot of it is, I don't feel ready for a baby, or I'm not happy with my relationship with my partner. This is the wrong time. I suppose I'd sum up and say that the main reason is timing. So most women having abortions want to have a child in the future. It's not because they think having a child at all is harmful to my life, or, I don't want a child for whatever reason. We know that most women would want a child at some point in the future, and many women already have children. So I guess the main thing, summing it up, is the timing issue. And so if we can find ways to empower women to continue their pregnancy in a way that empowers them also to achieve their life goals and aspirations in a way that parallels the freedom that men have, I think that would help a lot. Now, that's not to say that career is a good reason to end the life of a child. Clearly it's not. But I do at the same time think this is one of the times I think men do have to speak with a bit more humility and listening, not being silent, but speaking with real humility, is because although we should never just be silent about abortion because we can't experience pregnancy, we also do have less experience of the implications of an unwanted pregnancy or a mistimed pregnancy, and the implications that can have for physical symptoms or the career implications and so on. And so I think we do have to listen to the many women in the workforce who are mothers and who have chosen to keep their baby, who say that they face real difficulties with their employer, who face real difficulties with their education as a result of this. And we need to address those issues seriously. As I say, that's not a justifiable excuse to end the life of a child, but it is something that if we want to empower women and provide a fertile ground for children, and to empower women to have both, which I think we should and can, then I really think that we need to look seriously at those issues and see what we can do practically to give women that empowerment.
Allow me to give you an example. Your philosophical training might disagree with me heavily, but whenever I hear someone saying this is a bad time to have a child, I'm thinking there's the reverse of it. Let's say you're not having a child, you're having a brilliant career in the field you chose, and you're promotion after promotion, and one day you find out that your parents are sick, or maybe they're even dying. Would you say, well, Mom, Dad, I'm sorry, this is really a bad time for me to be taking care of you. Could you postpone it? Or put it bluntly, how about you die because you're an inconvenience?
Yeah. Well, I mean, in a sense, we're seeing that with euthanasia in some parts of the world. And it kind of shows this reality and the connection of these two things where, I mean, I guess the whole framework is that, they say that being old is kind of like a second childhood in some cases. I met someone who was in his mid-80s who was ripped, like an absolute, just a beast, could easily have taken me in a fight in kind of mid to late 80s. Some elderly people clearly are perfectly independent and active. I'm not saying this is true of all, but in general, of course, as people get older, they get more infirm and need the support of the people around them, and in particular their family. And that's something that we should all see as a duty. And we should all be able to realize that looking after family, even if it seems inefficient or kind of it seems harmful to your career or whatever,
inconvenient.
This is a basic part of being human, that you look after other people, and in particular your family. And we see in places like Canada that elderly people have euthanasia because they're lonely or because they're not supported by the people who should be supporting them. And so you really do see that this is a significant kind of issue, that we lack a sense of responsibility. And it's in a sense somewhat ironic that this is primarily coming from a kind of ideological group where the main criticism of conservatives or Christians is that they don't care. Well, mainly about conservatives is that they don't care about other people. They lack a sense of responsibility. We lack our responsibility to the climate or to the poor or to immigrants or refugees and so on, is the criticism that is often made of conservatives. And yet it's that exact same kind of ideological grouping, which in another way is profoundly individualistic and says, my body, my choice. No one has a right to my resources or anything like that. And so you see this kind of individualism that really has crept up within an kind of sect that is all otherwise very pro-responsibility and pro-duties to others. So I think there's a real disconnect there. And I think, in a sense, what Christianity has offered well is this radical ethic of self-sacrifice. And actually, Christianity says all of these. We have a duty to the alien in our country. We have a duty to the poor. We have a duty to our family. We have a duty to keep the environment safe and healthy for people and for the wildlife in it. We have a duty for refugees. We have a duty for our country. And so Christianity, in a sense, is the most consistent. It says we have duties to all of these, and we have to die to ourselves and bear our cross in order to serve others. And that's exactly what Jesus did. So I think part of the problem here, again, and this goes back to the question on why men are relevant, is because often men have not modeled that responsibility to their family. And so when you see men who spend all of their life just focusing on their career, earning a lot of money, getting all the prestige, traveling to fancy places, and neglecting their family, it's natural that women would point to that and say, why can't we do that? Why can't we have all these, fun and fancy things and all these high-flying careers and neglect our family? And I think it's an absolutely fair criticism. And I think that's, again, why Christianity and conservatives as well have said, or at least should clearly be saying, men also have that responsibility to their family. I don't care how much you're earning. I don't care how much important this meeting is. I don't care what 5-star hotel you're staying in Mexico or wherever else. If your family needs you, you have to be there for them, and you give up all of that. And so I think a lot of the problem has been that the fight for equality for women and men has been on those terms. It's been seeing the sort of lack of responsibility that men have and trying to take women to that level. And I guess what we want to say is it should be the other way around. Exactly. We're equalizing things by taking everyone to do the bad thing. Yeah. Whereas in fact, we should be saying, actually, it was wrong for men to do this in the first place. You should be there for your family and to look after the people that need you above your career. And that's far more important than your career. And I think once we have that healthy kind of model in place from men, I think it would be a lot easier to make the case that women also should not prioritize their career above their children, and that children need to be looked after and nurtured by both their parents.
This is one of the many times when the pro-life position is misinterpreted or actually is portrayed in a way that seems to reduce the whole conversation to just one point. Don't have abortions, when in fact, as you mentioned, it starts before even having being put in the position to think about having or not having an abortion. The way you build your family, the way you think about your future family as a man, the way you are aware of the responsibility, the biblical model that says you are the head of the household, and you are not only in charge, but you're there to supply and to care and to support everything, so a mother can raise her children not on her own with the resources you're providing, but together with you. And even here in Romania, the debate around abortion, whenever there is now there is the big, the loud talk about what's happening in the United States, and this is the reality. Whatever happens there, it has an impact here, even though the law is not changing here. You have people saying, "Yeah, you want to take abortions, you want to send us back to Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale," which has nothing to do with reality. And people are saying here in Romania, you hear them saying, "Yeah, you people, you just care about not letting us choose, but you don't care about anything else." Yet Christians encourage their men to first grow themselves to a point where they can sustain a family, then form a family, then have sex that leads to pregnancies and children, and then care for their children, not, as you mentioned, remove themselves from the equation and let the mother. But about this, you mentioned the duty of Christianity to care about others, and I know you've been doing work in Africa, and you have a partnership in Uganda, if I'm right, or
with some of the groups, yeah. So
Yeah.
I give them, I try and share kind of some of the research I do, and I try and work with people who are doing all sorts of things that help humans to flourish. So I've done some research on maternal mortality in Africa, for example, looking at whether legalizing abortion has helped reduce maternal mortality across the world and in Africa. And on the other hand, my basic answer is no. There's no evidence that legalizing abortion has helped reduce the number of women who die during pregnancy. But there are things that help women who die during pregnancy and help to prevent that. And there's some good evidence on that. And so, yeah, a lot of what I've done has been kind of research on maternal mortality and helping to create a safe environment for women giving birth, because although pregnancy and childbirth in the West now generally is very safe, and across pretty much all of Europe is very safe comparatively, in many parts of the world, there's still significant mortality during pregnancy. And so I've done a lot of research trying to find what are the interventions that really help there, because so often we see abortion promoted as a way of helping to save women in Africa.
Like the only solution.
Pretty much, yeah. And the International Aid Agency of the UK government was actually criticised by its independent watchdog because it spent so much on family planning and abortion advocacy that it actually just didn't put in place emergency obstetric care. It didn't put in place the basic emergency measures to save women's lives in emergencies, which we know is the key thing to saving women during pregnancy and childbirth. So they even pointed out, sure, if you stop every unwanted pregnancy, which you're never going to do, if you did that to the perfect degree, which you're never going to do, you would stop about 25% of maternal deaths. But what about the other 75% of pregnancies which are wanted and where women die? And it pointed this out, and it said, we need to be thinking about the large majority of women who want their babies, but whose pregnancies and childbirth are not safe yet. And one of the key reasons is because the West is pushing money into abortion and into family planning rather than into life-saving healthcare. And so I've done some advocacy on that in particular, trying to show that this is the case through my academic work. And so I've published a couple of papers on that, and, obviously trying to support other anti-trafficking initiatives and anti-poverty initiatives. And other groups in Africa and child sponsorship and so on. So yeah, I've tried to do a small bit of what I can as you know, what we're called to do to serve the poor in Christianity.
So you're not in this just to take away the right to abortion for women.
Well, I mean, it's really crazy that this is how it's portrayed, especially so something that a lot of people don't know. In many countries, when you look at opinion polling, women are more pro-life than men, and that's certainly true in England. So, if you look at the statistics, when we quote, you know, a certain percentage of the population thinks that the abortion limit should be reduced from 24 weeks, if you quote the number of women, it will be a lot higher. So it's kind of amazing that it's portrayed as like this thing about taking away women's choice. Like, I don't understand what goes through the mind of someone who thinks all of these women, all the women who were at the conference yesterday, they're just there to take away women's choice. Like, it's so facially implausible that, like, I can't see how anyone can sincerely believe it, but apparently some
lazy
people do,
thinking,
so
and maybe it's the hot debate is only about portraying the other side as being irrational or evil, even evil, and that's the easiest way to do it. You keep mentioning statistics from one place to another, and one thing that I would like to mention for our viewers and in general, it's not that we're cherry picking data. There is no data set that is uniform, or available data from one differs a lot from one place to another. And even in Romania, where we know the law says pregnancies are allowed up until the 14th week. But if you were to do polling, I'm sure people would say, some of them would say, you're allowed to have it up until birth. Some of them would say, "Oh, are you allowed to have an abortion in Romania?" And it's sad, since the statistics in Romania have put us as a country at the top of the list when it comes to the number of abortion. Not many people know, but Romania has had over 8 million abortions after the revolution, after the liberation, so to say. And there were plenty other abortions even before that. In the 1960s, abortion was outlawed in 1960s in Romania. That did not stop them from happening. And you had in 1967, if I'm right, just after the anti-abortion law was put in place, you still had over 200,000 abortions per year. And that's insane to think of it. Yet this idea of laws against abortion in communist Romania is used as an example of how insane pro-choice people say insane the pro-life movement is, because they are equating laws against abortion with communist laws, without knowing that the only reason those leaders, and we see that happening in other places in the world today, have been doing that not because they cared about children, not because they cared about mothers, not because they cared about families, they cared about demographics. How do we make people understand this? Do we need to teach them about the history of abortion? Do we need to... how do we put these statistics in a perspective that makes it personal?
Yeah, so the history in Romania is particularly complex and interesting. I think I guess where I'd start is that anti-abortion is obviously, in a sense, accurate, because, you know, we do oppose the ending of innocent human lives, and that's nothing to be ashamed of. But I do think that the pro-life label actually is more accurate and more helpful, because there are many reasons you can be anti-abortion, and they're very, very different. And the pro-life label gives a context for that, which is a lot more informative and accurate and holistic. And so it's kind of like So a lot of people maybe on a different political side to, typical Christian conservatives might be socialist, for example. It's kind of like describing socialists as people who are just pro-taxation. Like no one's really like pro-taxation just for the sake of it. They have a reason, and that underlying reason is profoundly important to why they are pro-taxation. It's so that they can distribute wealth more equitably among people who need it and who are suffering. At least that's the theory. And it would be charitable to describe the theory that way. So when I say that pro-life is a more accurate way of describing what we believe, it's because there really are many different reasons for being anti-abortion through history. So sometimes it's for population reasons. So even from as early as the Roman Empire, I think it was the Emperor Trajan kind of put limits on abortion and infanticide purely for demographic reasons, because he was worried about the decline in population in the Roman Empire. There was... we see that China's probably going to move in that sort of direction. We know that some Eastern European countries have been sort of talking about these sorts of issues in a way that's demographically focused. I think Abkhazia in Georgia might have restricted abortion for this sort of reason. And another very good example is Romania under Ceausescu. And so that is banning abortion because of demographic reasons or for other reasons is completely different for doing it because you believe in human dignity, protecting unborn life and protecting women, which is what the pro-life view says. And all the stuff we talked about the practical ways to support women and to enshrine that in the law. And I think that's so different. I mean, Nazi Germany is another example. They banned abortion for Aryan women, but they enforced abortion for disabled women or less mentally able women or for women of ethnic minorities.
Or Margaret Sanger, who was for
exactly, yeah,
abortion in order to reduce the number of black people in America.
Right, so it's sometimes you're anti-abortion for eugenic reasons, and then in other cases you're not anti-abortion. So the Nazis were anti-abortion for Aryan women, but they were not anti-abortion for other women. And that's exactly the same sort of... And that's clearly not pro-life. That's clearly not what we have in mind. But that's exactly what they had under Ceausescu. So in 1967, when it was banned... As you say, it wasn't banned. There were 200,000 abortions a year. It went up to nearly 500,000 abortions a year in the early 1980s. And these were legal abortions, 500,000 legal abortions a year under Ceausescu in the early 1980s. And if you just for comparison, Romania had a population of about 20 million then. The UK now has a population of about 60 to 70 million. We have one of the highest abortion rates in Europe. And even we only have 200,000 a year. So Romania had over double that with about a third of the population when it was restrictive. So it was like an absolutely insane number of abortions. And that's because the law still allowed abortion in many, many cases. It just was more restrictive than it had previously been and more restrictive than it is now. And so to say that Ceausescu banned abortion is not right. To say that he had a pro-life regime is clearly not true. This was a regime which allowed a lot of abortion. It was a regime that was profoundly anti-human dignity. One of the examples is that he didn't say that the fetus or the baby has inherent human dignity and needs to be protected by law. He said explicitly the fetus is the socialist property of the state. That's like the opposite of the pro-life view. Yeah. It's literally saying that a person is property. That is the polar opposite of what pro-lifers say. So he says we're having a lot of abortion, 200,000 or maybe even up to 500,000 a year. He says the fetus is the socialist property of the whole state. He says that there are many reasons we're having this restrictive law. One is for the health of women. One is for women's participation in the work. Well, that got very complicated. All of the Soviet Union and then the sort of communist bloc changed their laws multiple times since the 1920s throughout the 20th century. And they gave different reasons every time. And often the reason for banning abortion was because we need women in the workplace. And Ceausescu tried to combine this need for women in the workplace by allowing some abortion, and that's what Romania had done since the 1950s, with at the same time banning or restricting abortion because it was running out of people and it needed people to supplement the workforce. So all of it was economically driven, and that was the primary driving factor, particularly in Romania. And so Ceausescu wasn't just pro-life, he wasn't just against ending the life of an unborn child. He wasn't even against that. He was pro-natalist. And so you would have an absolutely draconian regime where in many places women were subject to monthly gynecological examinations in their workplace to check whether they were pregnant or not. Childless couples would be sanctioned and fined or given, penalties relative to people who conceived. And this is, which pro-lifer in the world supports that? I don't know any. I've never heard anyone out of meeting hundreds of thousands of pro-life people, never seen anyone who thinks that this, it's horrific. It's appalling having monthly gynecological examinations at a workplace to check your pregnancy status, to check that you're having children. It's just so far from what pro-lifers believe that there's just no plausible way that you can compare the pro-life view, which is that women are infinitely valuable, treasured by God, and should be protected and supported to have children, or to have children once they become pregnant, versus the communist state where the fetus is the property of the state, where women are routinely investigated to check that they're pregnant. Women are treated as property themselves in that respect. Women's primary purpose is to work in the workplace and to make children to contribute to the workplace, and where abortion is still allowed for hundreds of thousands of women a year. They're just, the two visions of society almost could not be more different. It really, to say that this is like what pro-lifers want is just such a distortion of reality that it's kind of difficult to believe. And so this is why I think the anti-abortion label has become unhelpful, is because although there's nothing shameful or problematic about opposing the ending of an innocent human life, it has to be seen in the framework and a context of why are you against it? Is it because you think that all human beings are equally valuable with equal dignity, including unborn children and including their mothers? Or is it because you think that humans are instruments and a means to economic prosperity, and therefore you can treat them however you like as long as they get the job done for you? And that's what Ceausescu's
socialist
legacy
Planned Parenthood.
Exactly. So yeah, I think they're very, very different for all those reasons.
I think one of the reasons we're having these conversations is because I want to make sure people are not ashamed of their anti-abortion stance, but they're also ready to defend this position in a way that shows the world they are actually pro-life. They do not actually care about the law that bans abortion. They are there for the unborn child, for the health of the mother, for everything that is that can be put under the name pro-life. And this is the kind of conversation that should encourage our viewers to dig deeper. And I'm so glad somebody from the UK comes around and explains us in very plain words and very knowledgeable about what happened here in Romania.
Which is not usual for English people to explain in plain words.
You're doing a very fine job. But I'm also aware that the conversation is always skewed, is always portrayed in a way that makes it hard to argue in good faith. One example would be that when we look at in the world, infant mortality rate is high. Infant mortality rate is perceived as a mark of an uncivilized society. On the other hand, the same people tell you that unrestricted abortion laws is a mark of a very civilized society. How can that be? You have Sierra Leone, as far as I know, has the highest infant mortality, and it's a tragedy. Out of every 1,000 births, 80 end up with the child dying, and that's horrifying. As you mentioned before, there are no measures in place to prevent that or to prevent the death of the mother. On the other hand, at the other end of the spectrum, you have Iceland that has almost no infant deaths, but they have very high abortion rates, and I dare to say even eugenics based on handicaps and other issues. How can the two be in the same place?
Yeah, it is kind of amazing, and you see this sometimes in studies, particularly in the mid to late 20th century, where eugenics was really still popular. I think there's often this perception that World War II and the Holocaust ended eugenics because everyone saw how bad it was. And that's really not the case. Eugenics continued in elite circles right throughout the rest of the 20th century. And it was only really kind of more like the 90s that population control and eugenics, which were closely related, kind of fell away. And they're now coming back, of course, with the new debates about climate change. There's new debates about these things. So, yeah, I mean, you see this very clearly. You know, in the developed world, we're told that it's a woman's body, it's a woman's choice. She can choose however many children she wants and so on, and no one should tell her anything about how many children she should have. It's her choice. Whereas in the developing world still, population control is very popular, and we need to reduce the number of children women have, not because they tell us that they want fewer children, but because we think it's just obvious that they shouldn't be having 3 or 4 or 5 children, and that they're contributing to climate change. So we have to reduce their fertility. And so although the eugenics is no longer as explicit in most circles, it's very much still implicit, with a sort of tacit suggestion that, well, I mean, eugenics was often around poverty. There was this sense that it wasn't just about, you know, the purely genetic traits that get inherited from generation to generation. A lot of eugenics was about poverty and saying that we should stop poor people having children because they have more poor children. Yeah. And it's the same sort of thing. And that's mostly what we see today, is that our population control is pushed on the developing world where there's a lot more poverty rather than on affluent people who can decide how many children they want. So I think, yeah, so all that to say, the kind of 90s was when that really stopped. And throughout the 20th century, eugenics and population control was still very popular in elite circles. And this is a really important kind of factor to remember when we're looking at the propaganda that was pushed during that time. Now, when it comes to countries like Iceland, absolutely, you see that they have eugenics. In the case of Down syndrome, they boast about having eliminated Down syndrome, and all it means is that they've aborted every child with Down syndrome before birth. In the 60s and 70s, like I was saying, you saw a lot of studies that were talking about, and even now you see these studies saying, if you ban abortion, the infant mortality rate increases or the child disability rate increases. And it's not because abortion has some, you know, positive effect where it makes people healthier. It's, I mean, even if those studies are true, which are, you know, they have significant problems, even if those studies are true, all they are saying is that if you kill a child because they're disabled before they're born, they're less likely, there will be fewer of them having disabilities and maybe dying from those disabilities once they're born. And it's just such a bizarre, it's kind of like saying we can reduce adult mortality by killing all the disabled children. Like, it's the most...
Which statistically would be true.
Exactly, yeah, of course. Yeah. If you killed every disabled child, the life expectancy for adults would shoot up. But it's so obviously a twisted, inhumane way to think about these things. But that's exactly what we see, is that we see these arguments that if you kill disabled children before birth, then there will be fewer of them having disabilities after birth, which of course is true, but it's barbaric. And in the UK, actually, we have a wonderful woman who has Down syndrome and is an advocate for people with Down syndrome, who is suing the UK government because in the UK, you can have an abortion pretty much in practice for any reason up until 24 weeks. But if the child is disabled, you can have an abortion up to birth. And it doesn't matter what the disability is. It could be a cleft lip, or it could be anencephaly, where the brain doesn't develop properly, and at completely opposite ends of a sort of level of disability spectrum. But she is saying, how is it that I, as a woman with disability, could have been killed at any point before birth, whereas for everyone else, you set a limit and say beyond that is not okay. And so she's saying that this is discriminatory. Other, human rights and disability bodies have said this is clearly discriminatory, and we hope that she's got her Court of Appeal hearing in July. So we hope that she will be successful. But obviously the courts do their own thing, kind of say what they want a lot of the time. But it really shows.
But she makes sense.
Of course. And she has been supported by a huge range of people that are not pro-life. Like she is, this debate, of course, in a way is about pro-life, because pro-lifers say that all human beings are valuable. And that part of that is that we have to treat disabled people the same. But in another way, it's divorced from the abortion debate in that you don't need to be against abortion to support what she's saying, and many people are not. So yeah, it's really amazing that you have this disconnect between abortion rates and then seeing infant mortality as a bad thing. And I think really it can only arise from dehumanization. And we see this with every mass ending of life in history, is that the only way you can really end life on a large scale is by dehumanizing first. Whether it was Hutus and Tutsis in Rwanda, where they would have to call the other side cockroaches, whether it was the Nazis saying that Jews were vermin or subhuman, whether it was other people in another situation saying something else. In the case of the unborn, we say that they're parasites or that they're clumps of cells. You have to dehumanize before you end life on a large scale, or else you simply psychologically can't do it in many cases. We're not wired to be able to just kill a huge number of people while we see them as people, as bad as we are, and as sinful as we are. And some people can do this. Most people can't do that, and societies can't allow it on a large scale unless they dehumanize first. And so that's why we see that, an unborn child is a parasite until they are born 30 minutes later, in which case they're suddenly a human being and a baby with full human rights.
I know that in the UK, 1 in 3 women would have had during her lifetime an abortion, and this makes it rather trivial. I think maybe this is one of the reasons where the pro-abortion movement wants to make it seem as a light issue, because they're trying to cover their guilt, to deafen the voice that says, to justify it, as you said, by calling it a parasite that stops me from having my career, because it has become so widespread. But do you think we should start saying that men, the fathers, those that have impregnated the women, have had abortions as well? I mean, is this a way of, I'm going back to what I said earlier, that men should be part of the solution since they are part of the problem. Should we start saying, you are responsible for this pregnancy, therefore you are responsible for this abortion as well? You had an abortion as a man.
Yeah, it's a very interesting thought. And I don't mean that in the English way. Normally when English people say that's interesting, it means you're stupid. But I don't mean that in this case. I think genuinely it's... So the language on this has changed over time. So I've done a lot of research recently because of this work on maternal mortality. I looked at every country that had legalized abortion in the 20th century, from the Soviet Union in 1920 to Sweden and Iceland in the 1930s and all the way through. And what they used to say was that they didn't used to say a baby is aborted. They said that a woman is aborted. So doctors abort the woman, meaning that they end the life of the child. And so in that sense, the terminology is sort of malleable, and even grammar purists or kind of language purists like me might be sympathetic to saying maybe that can make sense to say that, yeah, men have abortions. It would obviously, you'd have to to use the term having an abortion in multiple different ways, but of course we do that with many words, right? Lots of words mean multiple different things in different situations. And yeah, clearly the fact that abortion is so common is hugely relevant. I mean, in Romania, it was even the average woman in Romania had 7 abortions in her lifetime in the 1960s before the decree. And we don't know how many do today because many of them are unreported in Romania. The official number, I think, is more like 30, 40,000, which is still a lot.
A lot, because also the pregnancies have decreased alarmingly.
Yeah. So I'm sure that there are far fewer abortions in Romania than there were in the 1960s and even in the 1990s. I'm sure it has come down a lot, but it's still common, and I'm sure, it's not far off, and maybe higher, maybe lower, I don't know, than the 1 in 3. So either way, it's a large number. And this is really important because it means, when I speak to an audience of more than a handful of people, it's very likely that someone there will have had an abortion. And I also normally say, it's also very likely, if it's a group of men, that there's someone who has paid for an abortion, encouraged abortion, facilitated an abortion, pressured for an abortion, or in any other way contributed to an abortion, or even performed it. So maybe a shorthand way of saying all that is to say that, abortions are things done by parents. Both lose a child. Both were responsible. In some cases, it was only the man who was responsible for that child. So, except in those rare cases where the man is the victim, and of course they're real, but rare cases where the man will be the victim of a sexual assault. And I suppose in theory it's possible that the woman committing that crime would get pregnant from it. I get that does happen. We know that does happen. Those cases are obviously the minority of abortions, but in other cases, the man is the only person who's responsible. So in almost every case, what I'm trying to say is in almost every case, the man is partly responsible or completely responsible in some cases. And in every case, the man loses a child, and in every case, the woman loses a child. So the frequency of abortion means that we have to speak compassionately, and we have to be aware that everywhere around us, there will be people who are suffering, not just who are responsible for abortion, but who are suffering and hurting and need healing from having an abortion. And of course, that includes men. And as I said earlier, 25% of abortions we think are probably pressured by men. In many other cases, it would be implicit pressure from men and so on. And so we have to see it as a essential element of this, that the man is responsible for the child in almost every case. The man loses a child in every case. And often the man has done very concrete things to make that abortion happen. Taking the woman to the abortion clinic, telling her to go to the abortion clinic, refusing to give their money, or giving them money for an abortion. And so, I don't know, I'm not a marketing person. I don't know the very best way to kind of help people wake up to see this, but maybe one way is just to talk about abortion as something that a man and a woman go through and the baby goes through. I think that seems a plausible way to begin going about it. So I will give that some thought. And I certainly think that we need to be talking about abortion as a failure of society and as a social phenomenon rather than just a decision of one woman. Because although the decision being on one woman seems like it liberates her in some contexts, it also means all the burden and all the responsibility, and in many cases all the guilt, is on the woman. And none of that is true or should be true. We need to be clear that women have been failed by feeling they're pushed into abortion. And as much as we still think that they have done something wrong by ending the life of their child, we're completely deluded if we think that the primary responsibility usually falls on her.
Yeah.
The primary responsibility is usually shared across multiple people. And almost always the man has a really significant part in that. So for sure, I think we need to do better at thinking, how do we engage men on this issue? How do we show them their responsibility on this issue? And how do we speak in a way that makes sense of that and communicates that clearly.
I'm going to pick up on something that you just said, and I'm trying to wrap up this meaningful conversation by saying that many hot topics have become popular in the recent years through the use of slogans or campaigns. And I've heard you using repeatedly the idea that both lives matter. How do we take that slogan? Let's call it a slogan for marketing purposes. How do we take it and bring it in the public sphere, build a conversation around it, and what are the implications of both lives matter?
Yeah, a great question. I think, again, I'm not a marketing expert, so I don't know the exact best strategy on that. But I think I would say that it requires, firstly, concrete words and concrete actions. And actions will be, public actions that we do in the private sphere, I guess, outside of government, and then also policy. So we need to speak clearly. We need to say that men have huge responsibility in this, and to say that both lives matter. We need to be clear that both lives matter infinitely and equally. We often see the abortion debate portrayed as being, do you side with the woman or side with the baby? Which one do you prioritize? And it's amazing how often I get, after I've given my argument, and my argument is this: all human beings have the right to life. Unborn babies are human beings, therefore unborn babies have the right to life. Or all human beings are equal, unborn babies are human beings, and therefore unborn babies are equal. And the central premise of the pro-life argument is human beings are equal. And after I've given this, people will still say, so why do you think the baby has more rights than the mother? Like, it's amazing how often that is misinterpreted. And I always just say as clearly as I can, I don't believe that. And I often stop there because I want them to think about it and think about why they've misunderstood what I've said. So I say, every human being is equal. So the baby and the mother are equal. And the reason we're prioritizing the baby isn't because the baby has more rights or because it's more valuable. It's because the right to life is at stake for the baby. Whereas for the mother, it's the kind of abstract right to choice over someone else's life. And in every other case in human rights law, if the right to life is at stake, the right to life wins out. And that's why pro-lifers say if the woman's life is at stake, abortion should be permitted legally. And that's true in every country. Even in countries that don't officially allow abortion in that situation, in practice they allow it. So Malta doesn't allow abortion officially if the woman's life is at stake. But if you go to Malta, speak to an obstetrician, all of them will have done an abortion. They wouldn't have called it an abortion, probably, but they would say, we've delivered the baby and it passed away to save the woman's life. That's legal in every country in the world, either by statute law or by case law. And so that itself is kind of proof of the principle that pro-lifers actually believe, that it's about the right to life superseding other rights. So all that to say, the first thing we have to be clear about is that the woman and the child are equal, and that both lives really do matter. And to advocate for both their lives, both in the basic legal protections and in other policies that support those lives through contributing to their health, contributing financial support, contributing or mandating financial support and other support from the father. And so
life, not just being alive.
Yeah, exactly. And then, as I said, there's the kind of actions and the doing side. And that's going to be policies like those we just mentioned, like mandating that the father has a responsibility to be there and to provide. And again, this goes back to what we were saying earlier, that maybe one of the reasons this has gone wrong is that in conservative circles especially, is that there's been this traditional sense that the man's job is to provide kind of economically, and the woman's job is to be there for the child. Now, I believe generally that when you look at men's and women's preferences, there is a difference there, and that in general, women will want to spend more time with the child looking after the child. And that's, society should allow for that. But portraying it as the man's job is to provide, to go off and earn money for the family is completely wrong. Because the man's job, of course, the man should go and earn money and contribute to the family financially. And in most cases, the woman should also do that as well. And even most traditional mothers do also have a living, and they might do it from home or something, but the woman still has a job and provides economically in most cases. But the man has to be there as well. The man's job isn't just provide. The man's job is provide some, and maybe the lion's share of the economic support, but it is also to be there for the child and for the mother. And that's a crucial part, and that's the part that we've forgotten a lot about. So for sure that, a big part of it is acting and modeling that well, and showing that that both lives matter by providing for them and being there for them, and doing the things in our own individual lives that show that matters. And then the final way is the policy. So thinking through these policies, what are the ways that we can eliminate discrimination against mothers in the workplace? What are the ways that we can contribute to maternal health and reduce maternal mortality rates? How can we do the best we can in medical science to alleviate the symptoms of pregnancy, which can often be very severe? How can we empower women in places where they are completely disempowered and marginalized and often treated in horrific ways? I mean, we see Afghanistan, for example, that girls are not allowed to get an education. We need to be at the forefront of saying that girls deserve an education and should have the same access to it as boys, and they will flourish in that context. And so, there's a huge amount more. This is partly why, the feminist movement has been around for 100 years, and it's obviously changed a lot in that time, and parts of it have got very distorted in that time. But the basic roots of the feminist movement from the early 20th century and into the mid 20th century, before they started pushing for abortion and other things, had genuine grievances which needed to be shouted about and needed to be addressed. And many of those grievances are still true, and some of them have even got worse because of abortion, like discrimination against mothers in the workplace. I'm reading for a second time a very good book called Subverted, which is a journalist who worked for Cosmopolitan, and basically her job was to promote this narrative of a liberated, empowered woman who was free of any strings, of any responsibilities, to have sex with whoever she wanted and do whatever she wanted and have a career and all the rest of it. And then the woman changed her mind and realized that this was mostly not helpful for women and wrote a book about it. But what she was saying is that in the mid 20th century, some of what the feminists, including some of the key feminists who went on to push for abortion, like Betty Friedan, her central concern was, in the first place, mothers are being discriminated against in the workplace. And that, I believe, is a really, truly legitimate grievance back in the 60s and now. And this was a genuine concern. And then it was held that abortion would empower women to get away from that discrimination. And in a way it did, because if you can just end the life of your child, you won't be discriminated against for having a child. Yep. But when we think about it that way, and when we think that most women want to have children and want to have both, we see how distorted a solution that is. And we see how it's actually got worse.
And it's irreversible as a solution.
Because in the past, the employer could never say, you have to, or they couldn't legally say you have to get an abortion or you'll be fired. Now they can. Now women have no excuse for having a child, because the employer says, well, you could always have an abortion and it's your choice. And so again, we see that a woman's choice has turned into a woman's kind of burden and a woman's responsibility, without the rest of society shouldering that responsibility to provide for a woman who wants to provide for her child and continue her contribution in the workplace. So I think it's really important that the feminists, even in the kind of the 60s, where they began to become more radical and pro-abortion, many of the key feminists then were still talking about women being discriminated against in the workplace. And the solution to that discrimination is not to end the life of a child to get rid of the discrimination. That's almost like getting rid of discrimination against disabled people by ending their lives. The solution is to end the discrimination. I mean, it's the classic example of victim blaming in a sense. Like you have a victim of discrimination, and instead of tackling the discrimination and the person who's doing it, you say to the victim, we'll give you an option so that you don't have the thing that you're being discriminated for. And I know you don't want that option because you want your baby, but at least if you end the life of your baby, then these people discriminating against you will stop. Like I think everyone can see how twisted that is.
It has been a very meaningful conversation. And before going, I want to tell our viewers that they can find out more about this hot topic on your website, calumsblog.com. We'll have it in the description. And I know you have a wide selection of issues regarding abortion in the Q&A section there. And thank you for putting it publicly for all of us. Where else can people find you? On Twitter, maybe?
Yeah, the website is, I really wanted to put together something where people could go to one place for all the answers and statistics and evidence on this, because although, clearly personal story and, speaking in abstract terms and in terms of personal lived reality is important, because that's what we live as. I also think that the evidence, which is really just a collection of personal stories put together, is important. When I tell the story of Heidi Crowther, who's the lady with Down syndrome who advocates for people with Down syndrome in the UK, it helps not just to say that this was her experience and that she is discriminated against by this law, but that the evidence, which is thousands of people with Down syndrome, all sharing their story in a sort of structured way, I think that's really important as well. So all the evidence and statistics about almost anything you'd want to know about abortion is on the website. I'm also on Twitter and Facebook, so yeah, I'm happy to be followed on those and to hopefully share something meaningful and helpful. But yeah, I thank your viewers as well for having the patience to think about this vitally important topic.
Thank you very much. Thank you all, and I hope this has been a meaningful conversation. And if there's just one thing you stay with from this conversation, is that the pro-life movement is not the same thing as an anti-abortion movement. It's about so much more, and it's up to you to search, to find, and to understand the implications of all these that we talked about. Thank you again. Until next time.